October 19th, 2024, 9:42 p.m. The music hit like a pulse through the walls as Ray Holloway cut across the dark hallway of a private Vegas club. He wasn't there for pleasure. He was there because an old colleague insisted on one last reunion drink. He pushed open the door just as the house lights snapped to a focused beam, and 16 dancers stepped onto the stage in a formation so tight, so rehearsed, it made the entire room fall still. Ray's breath caught. He moved closer, the crowd blurring around him, as recognition slammed into his chest like a physical blow. The faces on that stage weren't strangers. They were the same 16 girls whose school bus he chased across state lines 20 years ago. The same girls the town buried in memory because hope eventually ran out. And now here they were, alive, moving to choreography that hinted at years of forced routine. Who controlled them all this time? And why reveal them now? Before we break down the truth behind this moment, tell me where you're watching from, hit subscribe, and tap that notification bell. Stories like this matter, and your support helps us keep these cases alive. Now let's pull back the curtain on how this nightmare started. October 19th, 2024, 9:42 p.m. The music hit like a pulse as Ray Holloway pushed through the narrow hallway of a private Vegas club, the kind of place where no one asks questions and everyone pretends they don't see each other. He wasn't there for entertainment. He barely even wanted the drink his old partner insisted he show up for. But as the room dimmed and the house lights snapped toward the main stage, something inside Ray tightened, an instinct honed from decades of chasing truth he could never unsee. Then the curtain shifted, and 16 women walked into the glow with a level of precision that made the entire room fall still. Their steps matched as if rehearsed for years, their posture controlled, their expressions unreadable. Ray froze, his vision blurred before it sharpened again, pulling each face into focus one by one. Older now, hardened, carrying the kind of wear you don't get from life, but from survival. He felt his breath catch as recognition hit him with the force of a blow. These weren't strangers. These were the same 16 girls he chased across state lines 20 years ago, the ones whose school trip ended in silence and unanswered questions. He moved closer without thinking, hands trembling, the crowd fading around him. A scar on one woman's cheek. A birthmark. Another girl once tried to hide with makeup. The way one of them tapped her heel twice before stepping forward, the same nervous habit she had back in the pep rally days of 2004. Ray whispered, barely audible over the music, "It's them." And in that moment, the years collapsed around him. Every press conference, every false lead, every parent he told, "We're still looking." Gone, replaced by 16 living answers on a stage that wasn't meant for them. As the women performed with movements that hinted at conditioning rather than choice, Ray fumbled for his phone, hands slipping, heart pounding. The camera catches his face as realization sinks deeper than disbelief. These girls didn't walk back into the world by accident. Someone shaped them. Someone rehearsed them. Someone kept them hidden long enough for their youth to fade and obedience to take its place. And as the music swelled, one question hit harder than anything he faced in his years on the force. If they're alive, then who has been controlling them all this time? 2004, a year that didn't feel historic or haunted or even memorable, just ordinary. The kind of year where the biggest news in a quiet Midwestern suburb was a high school football win, a new diner opening near the church, or the local grocery store finally switching to automatic doors. Families left their front porches unlocked. Neighborhood kids rode their bikes until dusk without anyone checking the clock. And every parent in town slept with the comfort of believing they lived in a place where nothing truly awful could happen. Danger belonged on TV. Tragedy happened somewhere else. Not here. Not in a town that felt stitched together by loyalty, routine, and a shared belief that good people were easy to identify. At the center of that comfort stood Principal Howard Ellison, a man whose name carried weight long before anyone realized it. To the outside world, he wasn't just a school administrator. He was the community's unofficial moral compass. Churches invited him to speak on youth development. Local papers praised his steady leadership. Parents boasted that their daughters were lucky to have him as a mentor. He shook hands with a warmth that made people trust him instantly. He remembered birthdays, complimented achievements, and showed up to every game, every choir concert, every award ceremony. In a place built on tradition, he became the embodiment of reliability. He had a presence that made people relax. His voice was gentle, measured, never raised. His posture suggested patience. His clean pressed shirts and polished shoes mirrored a disciplined life. To the public, Ellison looked like the kind of man who would have disapproved of chaos, protected children, and kept moral order. But that's the thing about appearances. They're the easiest pieces of a story to manipulate. Inside the school walls, Ellison's charm operated with precision. Teachers admired how he could diffuse tension with a single look. Parents appreciated how he would take a personal interest in struggling students. He built a reputation as a father figure, the person students could confide in, the adult who got it when teenagers felt misunderstood at home. And because he cultivated that image so diligently, nobody questioned the gentle way he spoke to the girls he favored. Nobody paused when he rearranged schedules for private mentorship sessions. Nobody noticed how he slowly isolated certain girls from their peers under the guise of leadership development. But where adults saw mentorship, some kids felt something else, something colder. A few girls stiffened whenever he placed a hand on their shoulder during assembly lineups. They avoided eye contact when he lingered too close at their lockers. Their reactions were small, subtle, fleeting, the kind of moments adults brushed off as teenage awkwardness, never suspecting these were early signals of a deeper discomfort. When a mother mentioned a late-night phone call Ellison made to check on her daughter's adjustment, her friends reassured her he was simply dedicated. When he stayed behind after hours, pacing between dark classrooms, a janitor assumed he was working too hard, not hiding behavior nobody had reason to inspect. Ellison understood the psychology of this town better than anyone. He knew people trusted structure, etiquettes, and polite reputations. He knew parents adored authority figures who spoke softly and appeared patient. He knew the school board would defend a man who had never once raised his voice and never once been caught in open conflict. He wrapped himself in reliability like armor. And he used that armor to gain access to the very young women the community believed he was guiding. What made him especially dangerous wasn't aggression. It was patience, a very quiet, meticulous patience. He studied the teenagers who gravitated toward validation, the ones eager to please, the ones with absentee parents, the ones who flourished under praise. They came from different backgrounds, but shared one vulnerability. They trusted adults who made them feel seen. Ellison made sure he was the adult who offered that warmth. He created small mentorship circles, special programs designed to build leadership. Parents applauded them, teachers accommodated them. And inside those carefully curated spaces, he built emotional dependence that nobody outside the room recognized for what it was. The signs that something was off were always brief, too brief to stick. Miss Jenna Price, one of the youngest teachers on staff, was the lone voice who noticed an imbalance. She saw how certain girls were being reshaped, not academically, but behaviorally. She caught the shift in their tone, their eagerness to please him, their nervousness around other authority figures. She sensed something wrong beneath the polished veneer. But whenever she approached colleagues about her instincts, she was met with polite deflection. He's just passionate. He cares too much, that's all. Howard? Impossible. Her concerns dissolved into silence, smothered by the weight of his flawless image. The town didn't merely trust Ellison, they depended on him. He was the reminder that their children were safe, that their school was honorable, that their community nurtured innocence instead of threatening it. And when a town needs someone to believe in, it becomes blind to contradictions, blind to unease, blind to the small, quiet moments that later grow into mountains of regret. Yet beneath the calm surface, something was shifting, slowly, dangerously. Not loud enough to cause alarm, but steady enough to change the lives of 16 teenage girls forever. A whispered warning ignored, a mother's discomfort dismissed, a teacher's concerns drowned out. All tiny drops in a bucket that would soon overflow into a tragedy no one thought their peaceful town could ever face. Because while everyone saw a protector standing at the front of their children's school, the truth was far more fragile. They had mistaken familiarity for safety. And the man they trusted most was quietly rewriting the lives of the very girls he claimed to guide. Before their faces became national headlines and their names turned into a 20-year ache, those 16 girls were simply teenagers navigating the fragile in-between space of growing up in small-town America. They were daughters who left half-finished mugs of hot chocolate on kitchen counters, girls who scribbled their crushes' names on spiral notebooks, friends who swapped lip gloss between classes, young women who believed the world was waiting for them, never knowing someone was already watching them far too closely. Their dreams were ordinary and bright. Making varsity cheer, getting into a good college, saving for a used car, impressing their parents, fitting in, standing out, all the things American teenagers chase with reckless hope. Among them were honor students with color-coded planners, girls whose futures looked like acceptance letters and academic banquets. There were cheerleaders who glowed under Friday night stadium lights, loved not just for their routines but the energy they brought to hallways. And there were quieter ones too, girls who hid anxiety behind shy smiles, girls who lived in homes split by divorce, girls who worked part-time jobs to help their families, girls who didn't realize how visible vulnerability can be to the wrong adult. They weren't perfect. They weren't broken. They were simply 16 lives blooming in different directions, each carrying her own mix of confidence and insecurity. And Howard Ellison noticed everything. He didn't pick his favorites at random. He observed them the way a chess player studies strategy, patiently, methodically, always several moves ahead. He watched who responded to praise, who softened under attention, who followed rules without questioning them. He paid careful attention to the girls who lingered after class, the ones who tried too hard to hide their need for approval, the ones who lit up when an adult finally recognized their efforts. For Ellison, these traits weren't qualities to nurture, they were openings. He approached them with gestures that seemed harmless at first. A compliment on a project, a subtle nod of approval during assembly, a quiet reminder that he saw potential in them. In a school where most adults were too busy or too distracted, his attention felt special. Parents heard their daughters mention him kindly and felt grateful. Teachers saw him guiding students and praised his dedication. And the girls? They thought they were chosen, supported, seen. That belief made them easier to mold. Ellison began separating them gently from their peers. He wasn't obvious. He never had to be. He invited them to join a leadership circle he designed himself, a program marketed as an exclusive group meant to build confidence and discipline. Parents beamed with pride when invitations arrived in the mail, printed on thick paper with the school emblem. Mothers hung them on refrigerators. Fathers congratulated their daughters at dinner. No one questioned why only certain types of girls were chosen, or why they were almost always girls. During those mentorship meetings, Ellison tailored his praise with precision. He told the high achievers they were destined for greatness if they stayed disciplined. He assured the shy girls they'd grow stronger under his guidance. He encouraged the cheerleaders to embrace grace and poise. And to the ones who struggled silently at home, he offered an emotional anchor disguised as reassurance. His words sank deep, reshaping how each girl saw herself and how she saw him. What nobody outside the circle noticed was how their identities began shifting slowly, subtly, almost invisibly. The girls who once confided in best friends started confiding in him instead. The ones who were once carefree became increasingly eager to prove themselves worthy of his approval. He taught them to value his opinion above all others, framing every instruction as a nudge toward becoming the best version of themselves. That phrase became a hook, a promise, a standard they felt compelled to live up to. While everyone else saw Ellison polishing young leaders, one person sensed something colder beneath the glow. Miss Jenna Price, fresh out of grad school, still idealistic enough to trust her instincts, noticed the tilt. She saw how the girls began orbiting around Ellison instead of each other. She recognized the unease in their eyes when he stepped too close, the sudden shifts in behavior, the way their personalities softened, then hardened, then softened again under his influence. Something about their new obedience didn't look like discipline. It looked like absorption. Jenna tried to speak up more than once. She asked colleagues whether they felt the mentorship circle had blurred boundaries. They brushed her off with polite smiles. She mentioned her concern to the vice principal, who gently assured her that Ellison was simply deeply invested in student development. She approached a counselor who told her she might be misreading normal teenage attachment. Every warning she tried to raise evaporated in rooms where Ellison's reputation shielded him like armor. The girls continued moving deeper into his orbit, unaware of how much of themselves they were giving away. Their parents felt proud, the school felt grateful, and the community felt lucky. Only Jenna sensed that something fundamental was shifting, and that the shift wasn't harmless. And then came the morning that changed everything. The morning those 16 girls boarded a bus they never returned from. The moment their seats sat empty in classrooms that still smelled like pencil shavings and worn textbooks. The moment their laughter vanished from hallways. By the time the sun went down on that day, Ellison's influence had already pushed past a line nobody realized existed until it was far too late. Because the truth was simple and devastating. Ellison didn't just choose these girls, he shaped them, carefully, quietly, until the idea of following him felt natural. Before we move forward, before we uncover how these 16 girls were drawn deeper into Ellison's influence, take a moment to like, comment, subscribe, and share this story. Tell us, have you ever seen an adult in authority earn trust a little too easily? Your thoughts help bring awareness to stories families never imagined they'd be part of. The morning of the trip felt like a celebration. For weeks, the girls had circled the date on their calendars, decorating the numbers with tiny doodles of monuments and inside jokes only their friends understood. It was the kind of excitement that spilled into every corner of their homes. Mothers ironing last-minute outfits, fathers fumbling with disposable cameras, siblings teasing them for packing too much. Dawn had barely broken when families gathered in the school parking lot, breath visible in the cool air, coffee cups steaming beside tired smiles. One by one, car doors shut, hugs lingered, and the ritual of letting their daughters go, just for a weekend, played out like it always had. With trust so unquestioned, it felt automatic. At the center of that trust stood Howard Ellison, stationed at the bus door like a gatekeeper of reassurance. He greeted each family with a calm nod, saying exactly what anxious parents needed to hear. They're in good hands. We'll check in along the way. It'll be a transformative educational experience. His voice carried the steady warmth that had charmed the town for years. Mothers handed him permission slips with grateful smiles. Fathers clapped him on the shoulder. The girls, already buzzing with anticipation, barely noticed any of it. They were too busy laughing, posing for photos, and planning which Washington, D.C. landmarks they'd see first. When the bus engine rumbled awake, the girls scrambled inside, taking seats they had pre-selected days earlier. Someone turned on a playlist. Someone else shared snacks. A teacher snapped a photo of them through the bus window. A frame of 16 glowing faces against glass, waving at parents, joking about who would fall asleep first. It was the kind of picture that ends up in scrapbooks, the kind families look at years later with nostalgia. No one realized it would become the last image of the girls the town would ever see in their ordinary, unbroken state. The bus pulled away at 6:12 a.m. Parents lingered until the taillights disappeared beyond the school fence. They trusted the route. They trusted the system. Most of all, they trusted Ellison. For hours, the day unfolded as expected. Families went to work, teachers taught their morning classes, and the silence of routine settled across the town. No one imagined that somewhere along that highway, the path of 16 innocent girls was about to veer into darkness. Around 10:47 a.m., the bus made its first and only recorded stop. A small gas station off Route 19, captured by a grainy security camera positioned above the entrance. The footage later became a haunting relic. It showed the girls spilling out of the bus in bursts of laughter, stretching stiff legs, brushing hair out of their faces, and moving through the aisles in familiar teenage chaos. One girl tried to balance 3 soda bottles in her arms. Another joked with a cashier about needing snacks strong enough to survive the never-ending drive. A pair of friends shared a pack of gum and posed for one more photo, unaware the moment was being etched into history as their last trace of normalcy. The camera caught Ellison too. Calm, confident, standing near the bus like he had nowhere else in the world to be. Nothing about his posture hinted at tension. No glance betrayed urgency. If anything, he appeared almost serene, too serene for a man supervising 16 energetic teenagers. At 11:03 a.m., the bus doors closed again. The girls waved at the cashier through the window. The bus merged back onto the road, and then, nothing. No more camera footage, no checkpoint arrival, no GPS ping, no calls, no texts. The digital trail simply evaporated, as though the bus dissolved into the air between two mundane stops on an ordinary highway. When afternoon rolled in and parents expected their first update, there was silence. At first, worry took the shape of gentle checking. Text messages sent, then resent. Phone calls placed, then repeated a little too quickly. Teachers waited for the "we arrived safely" notification that never came. By 3 p.m., unease tightened into fear. Families began calling each other, comparing notes, confirming that no one had heard a thing. Mothers left work early. Fathers drove the route themselves, scanning gas stations and rest areas with growing panic. By 5 p.m., fear became urgency. Police phone lines clogged with frantic voices describing the same impossible scenario: 16 girls and one principal, all unreachable. Officers repeated procedural reassurances. Delays happen. Maybe they stopped for lunch, but even they felt a churn in their stomachs that didn't match their practiced tone. A bus filled with minors does not go off-grid. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the truth solidified. Something was terribly wrong. Parents gathered at the school, pacing in tight circles, gripping each other's arms. Some cried, others shouted, a few stood in complete shock. The minutes felt like hours. Every new arrival brought the same questions. Have you heard anything? Did she text you? Did anyone see them after the gas station? No one had answers. All they had were ringing phones that delivered nothing but stillness on the other end. But the most stunning blow came at 8:21 p.m. When a police officer knocked on the hotel door Ellison was supposed to have checked into that afternoon. The room was untouched. Sheets crisp, towels folded, suitcase absent, reservation unclaimed. Ellison had never arrived. He was not with the girls. He was not at the hotel. He was nowhere. The town's foundation shook in an instant. The man they trusted with their daughters had vanished along the same path as the girls themselves. And as night fell over the community, an uncomfortable truth began pressing against every parent's heart. Trust is only as strong as the person who holds it. The girls were gone. Ellison was gone. And the world they knew was about to collapse. In the days that followed the disappearance, the town moved from panic to paralysis. What began as frantic phone calls and sleepless nights quickly hardened into a fear so heavy it seemed to sit on every doorstep. Parents crowded outside the sheriff's office clutching photos that still smelled faintly of bedroom walls and school lockers. Mothers begged deputies to check one more route. Fathers demanded helicopters, dogs, anything. But instead of action, they were met with hesitation, thin explanations, polite dismissals, and a sheriff stretching for logic in a situation that had none. When he suggested the girls might have run away together, the words punched through the crowd like a betrayal. These weren't children running from home. These were honor students, cheerleaders, volunteers, girls who left behind half-eaten breakfasts and bedrooms filled with future plans. Still, the sheriff repeated his theory, even as parents shouted through tears that their daughters didn't run anywhere without their phones, their friends, or their families. It was a claim so detached from reality that it fractured the town's trust instantly. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some whispered that the department was overwhelmed, others that they simply didn't want a scandal tied to their name. But one truth began to settle like dust. The people sworn to protect them were failing at the exact moment they were needed most. At the center of that unraveling stood the superintendent, a man more concerned with preserving reputation than uncovering truth. In a press conference held only 3 days after the girls vanished, he stood before cameras with a measured voice and rehearsed expression, insisting Ellison was a man of integrity and urging the town not to jump to dark conclusions. His tone implied the parents' fear was irrational. His words dismissed their instincts. And in defending Ellison so publicly, he unknowingly widened the crack between the community and the institutions that claimed to serve them. Inside the investigation, cracks became canyons. Documents the families expected to be handled with urgency began misplacing themselves. Bus maintenance records vanished from the district's file cabinets. Phone logs that should have been easily accessible turned up empty. A key witness report about seeing the bus near a service road went missing. Every time a parent asked to see updates, they were told some version of the same line: "We're still looking into it." But looking into what? There was nothing left in the files to look at. Teachers who dared to voice concern, especially those who remembered the unease around Ellison, were quietly pressured into silence. Some were told they were being overly emotional. Others were warned to avoid making damaging assumptions. A few were moved to different roles without explanation. Ms. Jenna Price, who had already sensed something long before the bus ever left the school lot, found herself treated like an inconvenience rather than a resource. Her notes about Ellison's mentorship circle were brushed aside. Her request to speak with investigators was pushed down the priority list. She watched in disbelief as those in charge did everything except confront the possibility that Ellison had played a role. Meanwhile, the case that should have taken over national headlines barely survived a week in the media cycle. Reporters covered the first press conference with mild curiosity, but once the superintendent planted doubt about the girl's intentions, the tone shifted. Stories softened. Interest faded. After a few days of scattered coverage, the news trucks left town altogether. The spotlight disappeared, leaving families standing in the dark with nothing but unanswered questions and a rising sense that their children were being forgotten, while their captor slipped deeper into shadow. Candlelight vigils became the town's only form of expression. Night after night, parents, neighbors, church groups, and classmates gathered with photos held against their chests. Prayer circles formed. Crowds cried in unison, but beneath the warm glow of candles and whispered hymns, something else simmered. A quiet, mounting anger. Each vigil ended with a plea for truth, yet every sunrise brought the same hollow silence. And as days stretched into weeks, the community began to question not only what happened on that road to Washington, D.C., but how an entire system could crumble so completely when 16 young girls needed it most. In kitchens across the town, dinner conversations devolved into theories and accusations. How does a fully loaded school bus disappear without a trace? How does a principal who never missed a day of work suddenly vanish? How does a case with this many victims lose evidence so neatly, so conveniently, so quickly? Every question pointed toward a conclusion nobody wanted to accept but could no longer avoid. The same institutions built to keep their children safe seemed more interested in shielding themselves. The trust that once defined their community cracked in ways that could not be repaired. Parents who once believed in law enforcement now questioned every word spoken by authorities. Teachers who once admired Ellison now wondered how deeply they'd been fooled. The superintendent who insisted Ellison was innocent now faced backlash at every public meeting. And as the town spiraled into confusion, the truth hovered above them like an unwelcome shadow. If this could happen here, in a place built on belief and familiarity, then no community was as safe as it claimed. Darkness settled not because answers weren't found, but because no one was truly searching, because 16 girls were gone. Ellison was gone, and the people left behind were beginning to realize the case was collapsing not from lack of clues, but from lack of will. When the case first crossed Federal Agent Maya Caldwell's desk, it wasn't because anyone believed she could solve it. It landed there because no one else wanted it. Old files, cold leads, a community determined to move on. In law enforcement, that combination usually meant the case was dead, and meant to stay that way. Maya opened the folder expecting a routine review, maybe a formality, but by the time she reached the third page, something inside her shifted. This wasn't incompetence. This wasn't miscommunication. This was abandonment, clean, deliberate, and chilling. The first thing that struck her was how thin the official investigation was. Reports were incomplete, signatures missing, interviews cut short. Important details that should have been highlighted were buried under unrelated memos. It was the kind of sloppiness that doesn't happen naturally. Not across this many documents. Not in a case involving 16 missing minors. Something had gone terribly wrong here, long before anyone admitted it. But it was the financial records that pulled her deeper. Money had flowed quietly through Ellison's school programs, small amounts at first, then larger transfers that didn't match any budget request. Thousands of dollars redirected into miscellaneous development, leadership investments, and youth outreach. Phrases vague enough to slip past a casual review, but alarming when lined up side by side. Maya knew laundering when she saw it. She'd built a career on recognizing patterns others missed, and Ellison's patterns weren't those of a dedicated educator. They were the movements of someone preparing something long before the world realized it. Then came the burner phones. Numbers traced back to cheap prepaid cards purchased in scattered locations across 2 states. One pinged near the service road hours after Ellison was declared missing. Another pinged near a rest stop the following morning. None of these locations matched the original search radius, and all of them connected to timestamps that collapsed the sheriff's runaway theory instantly. If Ellison had vanished alongside the girls, why were his devices moving independently? Why were their calls placed after his supposed disappearance? Why were these details logged in a way that suggested they were never meant to be found? The deeper Maya went, the more the story cracked open. A hidden disciplinary report from 1997 surfaced during her 3rd week on the case. It wasn't in the official file. It wasn't mentioned in any school board records. It was buried in a personnel archive from Ellison's previous district, flagged under confidential circumstances. The language was vague, deliberately vague, but it hinted at misconduct involving inappropriate boundaries with students. The report mentioned concerns raised by a counselor who later resigned under pressure. And it documented that Ellison left the district quietly, without a public explanation, without a formal investigation, and with a glowing recommendation letter that seemed to erase all concerns. He didn't escape suspicion. He was escorted into a new beginning. Maya knew this pattern too. Institutions often buried red flags to avoid controversies, lawsuits, or political backlash. But this wasn't a red flag, it was a blueprint. Ellison had repeated his behavior in a new town because no one stopped him in the last one. And instead of being monitored, he was elevated, trusted, praised, protected. She brought her findings to her supervisor expecting urgency, a task force, an expanded investigation, something. But instead she received a thin smile and a warning that felt like a door closing in front of her. "This case is too politically sensitive," he said. "The community has healed. Reopening old wounds helps no one." His tone was calm, but the message was clear. Let it go. Maya didn't. She couldn't. The girls' faces stayed burned into her mind. 16 teenagers frozen in yearbook smiles, all carrying the same unspoken question: who failed us? Their parents' grief lived in every line of the early reports. Teachers' silenced concerns echoed between the missing pages. There was a story here, and someone wanted it quiet. So she continued alone. She studied the bus route again, mapping each alternative road Ellison could have taken. She compared timestamps, cross-referenced vehicle logs, matched fuel receipts to travel windows. She visited the previous district he'd worked in, speaking with retired staff who remembered whispers but never proof. She traced the burner phone pings until patterns emerged, patterns that suggested scouting trips, preparation, and coordination that stretched far beyond one weekend school trip. Ellison hadn't acted spontaneously. He had planned, carefully, patiently. For years. Each clue carried the same implication. The girls didn't vanish because something went wrong on that bus ride. They vanished because everything went exactly the way Ellison intended. Maya's discoveries grew heavier by the day. What the town called a tragedy, she recognized as an orchestrated disappearance. What the sheriff dismissed as a runaway case, she saw as a calculated operation. And what the superintendent defended as a misunderstanding, she saw as a decades-old failure disguised as leadership. By the end of her review, one truth stood unshakable. The girls were taken alive, and Ellison had never planned for them to come home. Before we move on, before we reveal how far Agent Caldwell went to uncover the trail Ellison hoped would stay buried, take a moment to like, share, subscribe, and comment. These stories matter because people like Maya refuse to look away. And tell us, do you believe institutions would risk their reputation over uncovering the truth, even when lives are at stake? 20 years is a long time to live without answers. Long enough for seasons to blur together. Long enough for hope to fray thread by thread. Long enough for a familiar town to feel like a memorial instead of a home. In the years after the 16 girls vanished, the community aged in ways they never expected. Not visibly at first. Not loudly, but slowly. Through the quiet rituals, grief forces onto people who never wanted to learn its language. Parents kept their daughters' rooms exactly as they were on the morning of the trip. Alarm clocks stayed frozen at the times they last rang. Textbooks remained open on desks, waiting for hands that never turned the next page. Dresses hung in closets with tags still attached. Stuffed animals kept their places on pillows, untouched yet constantly held in memory. Every room became both a shrine and a wound, too painful to enter, too sacred to change. Marriages buckled beneath the weight of absence. Couples who once hosted neighborhood barbecues now struggled to sit across from each other at the dinner table. Some drifted apart quietly, unable to share grief that felt different in each heart. Others argued over theories, blame, what-ifs that stretched into years. The missing girls were no longer just daughters. They became the invisible force that shaped every conversation, every silence, every ache. Friendships that had been formed through PTA meetings and carpool lines fractured too. People who once leaned on each other now avoided eye contact in grocery stores, afraid that acknowledging the pain in someone else would reignite their own. The town's laughter changed. Its energy changed. Its confidence changed. Even school enrollment dropped as families transferred their younger children elsewhere, unwilling to trust a place that had lost so many without explanation. Ellison's portrait was removed from the school wall quietly, without ceremony. Where his name once represented integrity, it now carried the sting of betrayal. Parents who once praised him could barely speak without shaking. Teachers who once admired him carried guilt like a second skin. And his legacy, once polished and celebrated, decayed into the kind of whispered curses people mutter only when they are deeply afraid. Meanwhile, the world outside kept moving. News cycles shifted. New stories emerged. The girls became footnotes in a decade overwhelmed by tragedies. But not for their families, not for the town, and not for Maya Caldwell. She refused to let the case die the way officials hoped it would. She followed every lead, each one colder than the last, until she began to recognize a pattern no one else had bothered to notice. Somewhere in the background of 3 separate states, a man who looked like Ellison kept resurfacing under different names. In Idaho, he called himself a youth pastor. He preached obedience, structure, and renewal. Parents from small congregations recalled his soft tone and firm rules. He stayed only a few months, long enough to gain trust, short enough to avoid deeper scrutiny. Maya arrived 4 days after he left. In New Mexico, he became a camp counselor working with troubled teens. His colleagues described him as reassuring, patient, devoted. He organized leadership games that emphasized discipline and silence. Maya reached the camp 2 days after he handed in a sudden resignation. In Nevada, he resurfaced as a family mentor, assisting minors from unstable homes. His methods were praised by some, questioned by others. His sudden departure left no forwarding address. And once again, Maya arrived just a step too late. Each alias was like a discarded skin, each new town a temporary stage, and each exit perfectly timed, always just ahead of her. It wasn't coincidence, it was strategy. Ellison remained vigilant, adaptable, and terrifyingly good at disappearing. For the families left behind, time did not heal so much as preserve. Flyers faded in sunlight but were never removed. Refrigerator doors held the same photos year after year. Edges curling, ink dulling, but faces still bright. Parents recited their daughters' names as prayers. Teachers mentioned them in staff meetings even when administrators begged them not to. Memory became the only act of resistance the town still controlled. Children grew up hearing stories of the 16 lost girls, even if they weren't old enough to remember when it happened. New families moving into town learned quickly why certain streets avoided Halloween decorations, why certain anniversaries carried a hush, why neighbors left porch lights on well into summer. For 20 years, life moved forward, but the town never truly did. And Ellison, somewhere far from the place he once charmed, continued to reinvent himself. Every name change a reset, every new role a disguise. His ability to blend in became a kind of dark craft, perfected by practice and powered by an absence of conscience. But he wasn't invisible. Not completely. Not forever. Because on a night that seemed as unremarkable as all the others, inside a Las Vegas strip club where neon drowned out guilt and music masked secrets, 16 women stepped into the light in perfect formation. And when one retired detective recognized them, the world was forced to confront a truth it had spent 2 decades trying to forget. The ghosts of that town had never been ghosts at all. They had simply been hidden, shaped, moved, controlled. And now suddenly, they were standing before the world again. When the news reached the town, it didn't arrive like a miracle. It drifted in slowly, quietly, like something the world wasn't sure it was allowed to believe. After 20 years of unanswered prayers, it felt almost cruel to tell these families their daughters had been found. Even the official voice delivering the confirmation sounded hesitant, as if afraid the words might shatter the fragile hope he was handing them. All anyone knew in those first few moments was this: 16 women, discovered on a Las Vegas stage, matched the identities of the girls who vanished on that school trip in 2004. But the truth didn't land with celebration. It landed with silence. Parents sat down slowly when the confirmation came. Some covered their mouths, some reached for the nearest wall. Some stared ahead, struggling to understand how joy could feel so much like grief. For 20 years they had imagined this moment 1,000 different ways, reunions filled with hugs, tears, promises, second chances. But this wasn't that. This was something colder, something heavier, something they didn't have a name for yet. And somewhere in Nevada, Ray Holloway stood in the parking lot of that dim club, hands trembling, the desert night pressing against his chest. He had been the first to see them, the first to recognize faces he once chased across maps and time. But now that the truth was confirmed, he felt no triumph, only a slow, sinking realization that finding the girls was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of understanding how deep their disappearance went. Inside the club, federal agents moved in quiet, controlled motions, but the air felt wrong. Without the music and neon, the place looked hollow, like a stage built not for entertainment, but for erasing whoever stepped onto it. Makeup lights flickered over empty chairs. A faint smell of perfume lingered in the dressing rooms. Costumes were scattered across floors as though dropped in a rush. And the 16 women, no longer performers, not yet survivors, waited in a separate room, sitting with the stiff posture of people who had spent years being told exactly how to sit, stand, breathe. Maya Caldwell arrived long after the cameras and sirens, stepping through the doorway with the kind of quiet dread that comes from recognizing a truth you hoped the world would never confirm. She had followed Ellison's ghost for years, tracked him through aliases, vanished paper trails, whispered sightings, but nothing prepared her for this. Not the files, not the theories, not the late-night doubts. This moment felt heavier than anything she had carried through her career. She approached the curtained stage where Ray had first seen them and stood there for a long moment, letting the silence settle. Something about the place felt rehearsed, not chaotic, not hurried, but practiced. As if these girls had been repeating the same motions in town after town, night after night, until repetition became identity. It wasn't the kind of discovery that sparks applause. It was the kind that steals your breath. When Maya finally saw the women in protective custody, her heart tightened. They weren't shackled, they weren't crying, but they looked empty. Like people who had learned to survive by showing nothing. Their eyes flicked toward any sudden movement. Their hands rested perfectly still on their laps. When agents spoke to them softly, they responded with short, measured answers, as if waiting for permission to speak any longer. This wasn't just captivity. This was conditioning. And the longer Maya stood there, the more something inside her twisted. This rescue didn't feel like a rescue. It felt like a system unraveling at the edges. There's no sign of him, an agent whispered to her. Not a trace. And that was what haunted her most. Ellison's absence wasn't a coincidence. Not after 20 years of disappearing right before she reached him. Not after the pattern of aliases, quick departures, narrow escapes. Not after building something this elaborate. He was always careful, always prepared, always a step ahead of anyone who tried to follow. If he wasn't here, it meant he had already left. And if he left, it meant he left on purpose. Outside the club, the world reacted. Cameramen pushed against barricades, parents sobbed in hotel lobbies, people prayed in grocery store aisles. But beneath the wave of emotion, a darker truth lurked. These girls hadn't resurfaced because Ellison made a mistake. They resurfaced because he moved on. And that realization hit Maya like a cold wind. The girls had been found, but their captor had vanished into the world again, quietly, easily, like a man slipping into a new skin. The kind of man who didn't stop. The kind of man who didn't slow down. The kind of man who believed that reinvention was a right, not a risk. The truth had resurfaced, yes, but so had the fear. And somewhere out there, the architect of their disappearance was already becoming someone new. The world expected their voices to return with clarity, but trauma rarely speaks that cleanly. When the 16 women were finally interviewed, away from cameras, away from the stage lights that had owned their bodies for years, the room did not fill with screaming or chaos. It filled with whispers, soft, trembling, fragmented whispers. Testimonies that came out in pieces, like memories being pulled from a deep, underwater place where sound had been muted for far too long. What they revealed didn't just shock the country, it rearranged it. Behind closed doors, each survivor carried a story so heavy the walls themselves felt too thin to hold it. The truth came slowly, painfully, in breaths that shook and pauses that lasted too long. They spoke about Ellison, not the principal the town once praised, but the version of him they knew long before the bus ever disappeared, a version the world never saw. They described a man who wrapped control in kindness, who used soft words as chains and praise as a leash. He spoke to them the way a shepherd speaks to lambs, gentle, protective, commanding. He used religious language, not scripture itself, but fragments twisted to fit his own rules. Obedience brings purpose. Trust brings transformation. Sacrifice brings renewal. Over time, he didn't just manipulate their behavior. He manipulated their beliefs. He taught them that following him was not compliance, it was devotion. One girl, her voice barely audible, said Ellison made them feel chosen before he made us feel trapped. And once that emotional foundation was laid, everything else followed. They told investigators how the places they were taken to after the trip were not dirty basements or hidden cabins. They were far more deceptive. Some looked like youth rehabilitation centers with neatly made beds and inspirational posters on the walls. Others resembled church retreats, tucked deep in rural landscapes with crosses on the doors and schedules printed like boarding school routines. They weren't prisons. They were traps disguised as sanctuaries, places built to silence questions before they could form. Their names were changed almost immediately, birth certificates rewritten, photos confiscated, journals burned, hair cut to match assigned identities. They were told their old lives weren't gone, just irrelevant. Their movements were controlled with a precision that reshaped who they believed they could be. They were told when to sleep, when to wake, when to speak, when to be silent. Some days they were punished for asking questions. Other days they were praised for blind cooperation. The pattern wasn't random. It was conditioning, slow, methodical, intentional. When asked about punishment, a silence filled the room that made even seasoned agents look away. The girls described consequences that weren't loud or violent but suffocating. Hunger used as a lesson. Solitary confinement framed as reflection time. Forced silence that lasted for days. And when someone resisted too fiercely, they were made to stand before the group and confess disobedience, reciting phrases Ellison created, words designed to break them from the inside out. Years passed in cycles of obedience and reclamation, routine and discipline. The survivors said they eventually stopped keeping track of how much time had passed. Seasons blurred, birthdays disappeared, their old selves faded like faces in a fogged mirror. Even their memories of home became vague. Distant colors, distant sounds, names that felt like they belonged to someone else. Eventually, when Ellison believed they were ready, the next phase began. They were placed into entertainment circuits that stretched across multiple states, circuits run by people connected to Ellison through money, promises, and forged grants. The same school funds parents thought were supporting leadership programs had been funneled into a system designed to move these girls like property. Their synchronized routines were not artistic. They were enforced. They were trained to perform in silence, to follow cues without hesitation, to detach emotionally from the bodies they inhabited. One of the survivors summarized it in a single sentence that made the lead agent on the case stop writing. "He didn't kidnap us. He redesigned us." Those words echoed through the room like a wound reopening. And yet, for all the horrors they endured, for all the details they managed to recall despite years of conditioning, one truth sat like a cold stone at the center of every testimony. They had not seen Ellison in a long time. Not in months. Maybe not in years. They weren't sure anymore. Someone else enforced the rules. Someone else handled logistics. Someone else oversaw the routines. But Ellison? He had slipped out of their world before they resurfaced in ours. And that was the detail that froze every investigator in place. Because if Ellison wasn't where they found the girls, if he wasn't involved in their daily operations near the end, if he had stepped away from the very system he built, then he wasn't hiding out of fear. He was moving with purpose. The girls had come back, but the man who reshaped them? He was still out there, alive, uncontained, reinventing himself again. And that meant one thing. This story wasn't finished. Not even close. Before we continue, before we enter the final chapter of this case, take a moment to like, share, subscribe, and comment. And answer this honestly. If someone can change identities, belief systems, and entire lives, what do you think they're capable of once the world starts looking for them again? The raid wasn't supposed to feel like defeat. Federal teams approached Ellison's latest hideout with the kind of urgency that builds from months of dead ends. Boots hitting the dirt, flashlights slicing through the Arizona night, agents tightening vests and giving each other quick nods before breaching the door. For a moment, the world held its breath. Maybe this was finally the place where the past stopped running. Maybe the man who had ghosted through states and identities for decades had finally left a footprint they could pin him to. But inside the small, rented house, they found nothing that resembled a man on the run. Everything looked intentional, prepared, staged. The living room was stripped bare. No clothes, no dishes, no personal warmth. On the floor sat a metal trash bin filled with half-burned IDs, some belonging to men who didn't exist anymore, some belonging to names agents had already traced, some new identities he had never used but planned to. Nearby, a stack of wigs stood like lifeless mannequins, each one styled carefully, each one chosen to match a different persona. In the corner, sermon drafts lay scattered, handwritten pages filled with soft, soothing lines meant to sound spiritual, but threaded with manipulation. And then there was the notebook. A simple, spiral-bound thing with a cover stained by desert dust. On the front, Ellison had written 2 words in the same neat, controlled handwriting the survivors remembered from the early days. Second harvest. The phrase sliced through the room with a cold precision that made even seasoned agents shift uncomfortably. What did it mean? Was it a new plan? A new group? A new set of targets? The pages offered no direct explanation. Just outlines, sketches, philosophical phrases rewritten in different forms. Ideas that hinted at a future he believed he deserved. Ideas that suggested he wasn't hiding in fear. He was preparing. Witnesses across the Southwest didn't offer comfort either. A gas station clerk in New Mexico described a quiet preacher who spoke softly, with a calmness that made people lean in without knowing why. A motel housekeeper in Utah mentioned a man who tipped generously, always carried religious pamphlets, and traveled with no luggage. A ranch hand near El Paso claimed he'd seen a man matching Ellison's old yearbook photo, leading a group prayer with a few troubled teens behind an abandoned church. Each sighting came with the same description: soft-spoken, gentle, trusted immediately. The kind of man people opened doors for before realizing they shouldn't have. But the most chilling detail didn't come from strangers. It came from the survivors. Months after their rescue, when they were learning how to breathe freely again, learning how to sleep without schedules or commands, learning how to rebuild friendships, trust, and identities, letters arrived. No return address, no signature. Just handwriting they recognized instantly. Letters that read, "Fathers never abandon daughters." Some survivors crumpled the notes immediately. Some froze, unable to speak. Others held the paper as if touching the past would help them destroy it. But each letter made one truth impossible to ignore. Ellison wasn't just alive, he was watching, still reaching, still claiming ownership over lives he no longer controlled. The FBI placed him on the most wanted list within days. His face, aged, digitally rendered in multiple disguises, flashed across every major news network. Hotlines lit up, tips poured in, but every promising lead dissolved the moment agents arrived. Empty houses, freshly vacated motel rooms, recently cleaned rental cars. It was as if he lived 1 second ahead of the world, always slipping through the crack just before it closed. Meanwhile, the 16 women began the long, brutal work of reclaiming the years taken from them. Their days were filled with therapy sessions, medical treatments, and moments of fragile laughter that felt like first steps. They formed a support circle, one they controlled, one built on truth instead of obedience. Some created advocacy groups to help other survivors of psychological captivity. Others focused on rebuilding their families, their futures, their identities. A few struggled quietly with the weight of existing in a world that expected them to feel free just because the door had finally opened. But even in healing, they battled a shadow that refused to fade. The nightmare wasn't over. It had simply changed shape. Every time a letter arrived, every time a sighting came in, every time someone swore they saw a man with the same gentle voice and careful posture, the wound reopened. Not because they feared reliving the past, but because Ellison believed the past was unfinished. He was shaped by a confidence that bordered on delusion, a belief that he still had a claim over them, a belief that he could return at any moment and pick up where he left off, a belief that they belonged to him. And as agents scoured the desert edges of Arizona, chasing shadows across state lines, Maya Caldwell stood outside the abandoned hideout, staring at the notebook labeled Second Harvest. She knew what the title meant. She felt it in her gut, the same way she had felt the truth long before anyone else listened. He wasn't running out of fear. He was reinventing himself again. And men like Ellison don't disappear. They evolve. Somewhere beyond the reach of flashlights and headlines, somewhere in the wide, empty stretches of the Southwest, a man once trusted by an entire town was still shaping himself into someone the world wasn't prepared to meet yet. And the most terrifying truth wasn't that he was alive. It was that he still believed those girls belonged to him. In the end, this story doesn't give us the comfort of a clean resolution. It doesn't offer the mercy of a final arrest, or the satisfaction of seeing justice catch up to the man who stole 20 years from 16 innocent girls. What it gives us instead is truth. The kind that settles into the bones and refuses to leave. Truth that forces us to ask hard questions about trust, about systems, about how easily a community can be blinded by the face of a man they believed would protect their children. The girls who survived him are still learning how to exist in a world that moved on without them. They're rebuilding themselves one fragile step at a time, stitching pieces of identity back together with courage no one should ever have had to develop. And while they fight to reclaim their lives, Ellison continues to drift through the world like a shadow that refuses to die, reinventing, reappearing, reaching. This isn't just the story of 16 girls. It's the story of every warning ignored, every instinct silenced, every system that chose reputation over protection. It's a reminder that real monsters rarely hide in the dark. They hide in trust. And before you go, if stories like this matter to you, if you believe these voices deserve to be heard, then make sure you subscribe, like, share, and comment below. Because the more we tell these stories, the harder it becomes for men like Ellison to disappear.